Church family, coming to you today from the living room of Brother Victor and Mrs. Hazel Burl, and we're delighted to have this opportunity to interview Brother Victor along with Roy Corser here with me as well. And on this anniversary celebration, I wanted to take the opportunity to talk to these men that God used to form the church that we are enjoying here at Fundamental Baptist Church, and just delighted to have this opportunity to have them still with us and to be able to share some of the stories from the history that most of us were not around to see, and it's just a tremendous blessing to be able to have this opportunity to do that. And so I've got a series of questions that I want to ask of Brother Burl and Brother Corser as well, and allow them the opportunity to share some of these stories. So we're going to start with Brother Burl, a question for him, because really the founding of Fundamental Baptist Church goes back to what God did in Brother Burl's life many years ago in leading him to Christ and then calling him into the ministry. And so I wanted him to just share some of those details about how God worked in his life to bring him to salvation, and then how the Lord called him to ministry. So I'll turn it over to you, Brother Burl. Would you be willing to just share with us how you came to know Christ, and then how it was that the Lord called you into ministry?
Yeah, okay. I'll start with my being stationed in the airport in Yarmouth, and my discharge paper had just come through, and my discharge leave was starting the next day, and I felt that that would be the last time that I'd be in a place of flying. So I went up for a flight in Yarmouth, and we were flying down along the south shore of Nova Scotia, and I asked the navigator where we were, and he said that island down there is Cape Sable Island. And I thought, well, I used to go there every summer. My mother came from there, and I used to go there every summer on vacation. My leave was coming up the next day, so I decided I'd get down for a visit. And so the next day I went down to Cape Island, and all of my mother's people, brothers and sisters, were there, and they were all saved. Max Walzer, who was the pastor there, and had established the Independent Baptist Church on Cape Island. And all of my aunts and uncles were what I now know as saved people. And I might also add that all of Hazel's aunts and uncles and parents were also saved. And I had an uncle and aunt there that had lost their only son in a bombing raid, and he, like I, was a air gunner, but he got killed about halfway through. So when I went to Cape Island, my aunt or my uncle came to me and asked me if I would live with them to take the place of their son, and I did. And so, to make a long story short, I graduated from Ranger School, was working as a forest ranger, and so my uncle had a heart attack and died, and so I went there to comfort my aunt, and Max Walzer was there comforting her as well. So when he left, I walked with him down the road to his car, and I asked him about heaven. I told him I knew my uncle was there, but I didn't know anything about it. And so he started talking to me about the things of the Lord. And the following Sunday, I went to church, and he preached the gospel right at me, I'm sure. And I got under conviction. And the next day, I was going to go back to the game sanctuary, but Hazel and my aunt persuaded me to go to talk with Mr. Walzer before I went in. So I finally gave in and went. And he led me to the Lord in his study that day. Well, it wasn't very long after that I began to feel that I had to go into the ministry. And so I spent a lot of time talking with him, reading his books, and so he set up cottage prayer meetings and got me to speak at these cottage prayer meetings, and that was my first preaching. And then after a while, I heard about a few people in Chelsea that had left the convention, and I went there to minister to them, and I organized a church there in Chelsea, and then I felt called to go to Moncton and try to establish an independent Baptist church in Moncton. And I was there, but being called into the ministry, I said, what are we going to do for support? And I visited most of our independent churches in the Maritimes to see if they'd take me on for home missionary support. And I talked with Hazel about it, and I said, well, if I get a promise of $25 a month, I'll resign my job and step out. The next day, I had a letter from the church at Clark's Harbour, and they had agreed to support me $26 a month. So I resigned my job and started out with, and some of the other churches took me on for a little bit. So we started there in Chelsea. We organized a church after some time, I forget how long it was, and we built a church building. Even the women were working toward building the church building. And then I felt the call to Moncton to start a church there. And I had, eventually about 25 people, or somewhere around that. And I was having meetings in a schoolhouse. And during that time, Morris Fletcher and Mel Reed took about 100 people out of the Highfield United Baptist Church, and they started Emmanuel Baptist Church in Moncton with, I guess, around about 100 people. Well, I had a call to the churches down along the shore, so I thought, why stay here, Moncton, and try to start a church with so little to start with, when here's Emmanuel with 100 to start with. So I accepted the call down along the shore, and I wasn't down there very long before I had the urge to start a church in St. John. And there was the Chadwick family came to church there in Chance Harbor, and I gave an invitation that night, and Barb came forward, and her sister, and then her mother, and her husband, or her father was there, and I looked at him, he had his fist doubled up, and he came, I thought he was coming up to the pulpit to beat me up. Instead of that, he came to the pulpit and got saved. So I had that whole family had made a profession, and they were living in Manawaganish Road here in St. John. And then I had 2 or 3 other families, well, Marjorie and Helen Day at that time, they came, and so I had the Day family, and I had the Chadwick family, and then I heard of a few women that had left the convention church here in St. John, and were having Bible studies. So I got in contact with them and started having Bible studies with them.
So Brother Courser, this turns over to you now. When did you arrive in St. John, and what were some of the circumstances that led you here?
I think it was 1953. In January 1953, I went to work for NBTEL in Fredericton. And I put in 7 years in Fredericton until the guy that hired me sort of retired, and a new boss come on site, and he decided that the office was not big enough for the both of us in Fredericton, so he transferred me to St. John. And with kicking and screaming, we decided, well, I guess if we're going to get work, we got to go to St. John. So we came to St. John, and not realizing what we were going to get into or what the situation was, we knew there wasn't a church in St. John that was an independent Baptist church. We had left the convention in 1950 and figured we couldn't come to St. John and go back into the convention. So that's what started, got us here. The Lord moved, and I know he was not happy with me, but the Lord was working. And
So how did you meet Brother Burl?
well, in 1950, when I was shortly after I was saved, we were meeting at a home in Newcastle Bridge, and Brother Sweetland was starting a work in Fredericton. They had purchased a building, and the building was an old army hut that they had, and so they went to the city. The city said, you can't use this in the city. So they gave it to the Newcastle Bridge building, and Victor's brother, Richard, came down to put the building together. So while he was working on the building, well, my weekends and days off, I would go down and work with him. And he talked a lot about Brother Victor here, and him just going into the ministry and just getting started. So shortly after that, we got the building going. They had they got the church organized at Emmanuel, and they held a conference there at Emmanuel, and that's where I first met Victor. Was at that conference.
Maybe you've already kind of answered this, but is there any more you'd want to say about what led you both to see the need to start a church rather than just joining an existing church?
Well, the only existing churches, the Baptist churches that we knew of in the city were United Baptist churches, and we figured we couldn't associate with them or become, even attend them. And so I started going, Buda and I started going down to shore to services, and Victor and I did some talking, and he kept explaining to me about these women that he had the Bible study with. One of the things he was mentioning to me was that they really didn't have a place to get together. So on our way home, Buda and I talked it over. We prayed about it for the next week, and then the next following Sunday we talked to Brother Burl again, and we said, well, we'll open our home and you can all start the meetings there. And that was a result of starting things. We maybe didn't have enough faith to believe that we could start a church, but with Brother Victor's help, things came together, and that's where we are today.
So where was that apartment?
490 Douglas Avenue,
Okay.
3rd floor.
We decided we'd have meetings in his apartment, and I don't know how many we had, but I do remember that their apartment was upstairs, and we started meetings on a Wednesday, wasn't it?
No, it was Tuesday night.
Tuesday,
Yeah,
okay, and
because you had prayer meetings on Wednesday nights, so,
yeah.
yeah.
So the landlord didn't appreciate our singing
Yeah.
and all that. So we decided we had to move. So we moved to Maynard Chadwick's home, and we are having meetings there. Well, in the meantime, we were talking about organizing a church, and so we started drawing up a constitution. And Terrence Fraser was there with us, and basically it was our 3 families, I think at the time, 4 families,
Yeah.
Maynards, that we
For a day.
start working on the Constitution. And I was preaching 5 services on Sunday, and then with the other meetings, I was preaching every day of the week. Well, Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah.
Well, I was preaching 5 services on Sunday, and then all the rest of the week. So that pretty well tied me up. And so I suggested that they call Doug Fraser, but I had no idea that he'd accept it, and others were involved in that thinking too. And they called Doug Fraser, and he accepted. So once he accepted, he became their first pastor, and it was under his ministry that they organized the church. Now, I had moved to Maces Bay in 1959, and so I was there at that time, and so the main Hedrick's home was getting too crowded, so we got the little red schoolhouse
Yeah.
on Manawagash Road, and Doug Fraser came down and he had his first meeting in that little schoolhouse.
Yeah.
Well, I stepped out of the picture then because they had a pastor.
One highlight that came shortly after we started meetings, he mentioned Terry and Dale. Well, Terry and Dale moved to St. John. They didn't have any place to stay or that sort of thing, so they moved in with Buda and I. And Dale used to play the piano for us at these, with the sing. She was in the bedroom where the piano was, and the rest of us were all in the living room down the hall. So she had to play loud enough that you could.
Brother Roy, what were the concerns with the convention back, in the 50s and 60s that caused you to come out in the first place and then start an independent work here?
The reason we broke away in Newcastle Bridge at the time was the pastor that came on the site there at the convention. He didn't agree with the first few chapters of Genesis. He was not sure of the deity of Jesus Christ. So we just couldn't take it. We just said that's enough. I'd only been saved about 6 months when we started talking about what we're going to do, and the Farrell family opened up their home, so we started services in theirs. But then when we came to St. John, and we did visit a couple of churches and found that they weren't any different. The convention was, I had some ties with the convention with my sister, who was deeply involved, and they were ordaining women, and they were teaching things that were not biblical, so we with that state in them, we just had to leave it.
I was brought up in the United Church of Canada, but I don't remember ever having heard the gospel in that church that I went to, but only went very occasionally. But Max Walzer had taken a group out of the convention. That's where he was preaching initially, and he led hundreds of people to the Lord. Cape Island, that church has always been a fairly consistent work of hundreds or more. Yes, I think well over 100 probably. But he left the convention in 1935, and they built a church at Clark's Harbor shortly after, and they had a real solid work going there, and so it also was a separatist church from its organization back in the 35, and Max Walzer had preached there for many years, and he was my mentor, and he got me going in the ministry, and he had me preach these college prayer meetings, and this was it was a separatist work right from the beginning. So I've been involved with the Independent Baptist movement since way back then. That'd be in the early 50s. Yeah, I started preaching, I think, having those college meetings back in 1952. So I was involved with the independent work, and I took a separatist position right from those early days. And it grew stronger as I found out what was going on in the religious world, when so many preachers had left the faith really and were just basically social churches, most of them, or many of them, I don't know what percentage. So there was the first legal battle that took place really was in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia, and people got out there and formed independent churches. Kingston Bible College was the school that the independent started back there in those, I'll be in the 40s, I would think, or maybe, yeah, back right around 1930 when basically the independent work started and people were leaving the convention. There was a lot of people, a lot of preachers that wouldn't leave the convention and stayed in it and talked about reforming it from the inside, which they didn't do. So the same thing that happened here really was happening in different places around the Maritimes.
Well, of course, I wonder, did you ever imagine at that time what God would do and that the work here in St. John would become what it is today?
I guess I had little faith. I would have felt back in those days that from my association with the independent work that although Moncton was about 100, I would say at that time, and the rest of the churches were all relatively small. So I would have thought in my mind, I guess I thought about it last night. I said, no, I really didn't think we'd ever see much more than maybe 100, but that would be about the maximum you'd see.
I'd ask you the same question there, Brother Victor. Did you ever imagine that God would do here what He's done?
No, I had no idea. The largest church in our fellowship really was Emmanuel with 100 or so, and I wondered when we were getting ready to organize the church here, I never expected really to see 100. But anyway, it grew.
What do you account for that?
Well, Doug Fraser was what I would call a pulpit man. He really was a strong evangelical preacher, gospel preacher, and he took a real good stand on separation. And so when they were organizing here, I remember Bill and Joan, they came in 10 months
Yeah.
after he had organized. But I never expected it would ever grow to, well, 100 was the top in
Would
my
have been the
mind.
top, yeah.
Yeah,
So having seen God at work here really for the last 60 years, since 1962, really it was October 30th, 1962 that the church officially started. So here 60 years later, what words of encouragement would you give the current FBC membership?
I would say that as long as the church maintained its separatist position, then it was a reason for its growth. And I figured as long as they stuck with the separatist position and didn't water it down like so many other churches have done, that it would be a solid work and continue that way. I expected this church was going to be a solid church, and as long as they maintained that separate position, and Doug Fraser took a real strong stand there, and so that was the church's position from the very first. And so when you came, I had a big question in my mind: what's it going to be like sitting under a new pastor? And I was quite, well, then we start talking, and I realized we were on the same page, and I thought, good. And then I sat back, and I've been smiling in my service, and the services ever since pretty well. I was pleased.
Yeah,
And I figured, well, you're taking the same position, and I figured you had a lot of wisdom on how to go about things, and you were, as it were, taking your time in developing the situation here, and it's where it is today, and I expect this. I was going to say, as long as you stay here, it'll stay solid.
Well, of course, I'll ask you the same thing. Having seen God work here since the beginning, going back 60 years now, what words of encouragement would you give the current membership?
I don't know what more I can add to what he's already said. You know, the foundation we had when we started here, Brother Fraser was, he continually preached the word. He really took a strong separatist stand, and I think in the future, if we lose that, we've lost it. And we have no reason to be here if we drop that position.
Yeah.
You know, we can go down the street and get the same thing if we.
It's been a very helpful and informative time, I trust, for all of us. It's so good for us to recall our history, where we've come from, why we are what we are, and it is our desire to continue to uphold the truth and maintain the stand that has been taken really since the beginning and until the Lord tarry, to be faithful to the Word, and I trust that becoming better acquainted with the history will just help us to understand the course that has been set for us already, and the desire that we have to continue to maintain that course, and as well to just recognize what God is able to do just through people who are willing to just be humble before Him and be wholeheartedly pursuing God and His will, and just to see what God can do. He truly is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we could ever ask or think, and certainly that has been the case with Fundamental Baptist Church over the years, and we trust that that'll continue in the days ahead.